Well, hey everyone. A big shout out to the Burwood family who are currently taking refuge in cyberspace and anyone else joining into one of our worship groups today. My name is Euan Bradley, if we haven't met yet, and I get the privilege of speaking at Burwood Church from time to time. As well as saying hi, I would like to wish every person here a very happy new year and to bring comfort to those of you who have broken your New Year's resolutions already by reassuring you that statistically, 80% of people have broken their resolutions by the end of January. So you're in good company and you don't need to hold out on that chocolate any longer. Remember that in the eternal struggle between human and chocolate, that chocolate has won almost every single time. When I was growing up, one of the really popular comic strips of the day were the Peanuts cartoons. Names like Lucy, Charlie Brown, Snoopy, Linus, and so on were household names. One of the running gags in that cartoon was Lucy amusing herself by promising Charlie Brown over and over again that she would hold a football for him while he comes running up and kicks it. Usually Charlie Brown refuses to play ball. Lucy has tricked him on so many occasions in the past that he's just not ready to trust her this time round again. Well, because this gag is usually set at the beginning of a new year, Lucy promises Charlie Brown, cross her heart and hope to die, that this year is going to be different, that she has turned over a new leaf and finally manages to persuade Charlie Brown to trust her one more time. Well, as you probably know or can guess, Charlie Brown runs up to kick the ball, but at the very last second, Lucy pulls the ball away. Charlie Brown goes flying up into the air, crashing back to the ground, and the gag ends with Lucy reminding Charlie Brown yet again that he should never have trusted her. What was he thinking? I wonder if you feel that's where we are as a people at the end of 2020. Going into a brand new year. Is all we have left after such a tumultuous year the disappointments and the rather shaky faith of that lovable loser Charlie Brown that maybe this year in 2021, maybe this is the year we will finally get to kick the football. You know, it's certainly understandable why many of us would feel that way. But before we consign 2020 to the dustbin of history, I would like to suggest that we leave that year behind with some very important takeaways. Perhaps instead of banking all our hopes and expectations on the year to come, we can take some of the learning from 2020 and use that to enrich our lives right now. If nothing else, simply to affirm our faith in that beautiful biblical axiom that all things work together for good. Now, of course, there are many takeaways from the events of 2020 that we could talk about, but I would like to hone in on three that were brought home to me as the year came to a close. And I'd like to reinforce the relevance of these three elements by placing them into another time and context and reflecting on their importance back then, as well as in our own time. The parallels that I'm going to draw are those that come from the life and times of my favourite Bible character next to Jesus, and that's Nehemiah. So let's dive in and take a look. The first takeaway for me from 2020 was being reminded of the indispensable nature of leadership. You know, prior to 2020, most of us probably never gave a second thought to those leaders entrusted with our safety and well-being, whether that be physical or psychological. For example, here in Victoria, who had even heard of Brett Sutton or Catherine Bennett or Mary Louise McLaws or knew what they did? And if we didn't find politics and politicians boring, it was probably only because we were sniping and complaining about something they had said or done. But the pandemic changed all of that, at least for me anyway. Suddenly we saw our leaders in a whole new light. It had escaped us that in times of crisis, our lives were literally in these people's hands. The decisions that they made from day to day could mean the difference between life and death. We needed them. We needed them to be people who knew what needed to be done. People with wisdom, the ability to see ahead, to be fixers, to see a problem and know what needed to be done. More than anything, we needed them to bring us hope, to help us believe that we could get through this if we just gave them our trust and cooperation. Even when poor leadership decisions were made, and we all know there were many of them, all that did was reinforce how important it was to have good leadership and good decisions being made. Good leaders and poor leaders were on display around the world, and we saw all too clearly what happens when leaders fail their people. 2,400 years ago, God raised up a leader at an equally critical moment in Israel's history and helped save an entire nation. The life of this man, Nehemiah, still inspires and challenges us today. There are so many words that we could use to describe Nehemiah. Every one of them would be appropriate. Leader, visionary, doer, passionate motivator, strategist, the list goes on. As some of you will know, there was a backstory to Nehemiah's call to leadership. Israel had been defeated over a century earlier. Jerusalem had been destroyed and its people scattered across the ancient world. Many had been taken as far away as Babylon, 700 miles to the east. In fact, when the story of Nehemiah opens in around 445 BC, we find him living in exile in Susa, the capital of Persia, 1,000 miles from Jerusalem. That's approximately the distance from Melbourne to Brisbane. Several years before Nehemiah, some Israelites had been released from captivity and were allowed to return to the Holy Land. The temple in Jerusalem was rebuilt, and people started to get their hopes up. Maybe this would be the realization of Israel's nationalist dreams. But there was a problem. They desperately needed to rebuild the city walls to defend themselves against marauders and those hostile to the idea of a new Israel rising from the geopolitical ashes. Jerusalem was a city in crisis, much like the great cities of the world right now. The Israelites needed a ring of steel for their protection, or in the language of the day, a wall of stone. One day in Susa, Nehemiah gets word that the situation in Jerusalem has become critical. Not only does the city remain in ruins, enemies surround the city. The feeble attempts at reconstruction have failed. The gates lie burned and unhinged. The people who returned are living in fear. They have no sense of direction, and all seems lost. And Nehemiah sits down and weeps. Not because he's a delicate character. After all, he was the king's wine taster. He had stared death in the face every single day. And he wasn't crying because the walls of Jerusalem lay in ruin. The part that really got to Jeremiah as a passionately devout Jew is that God's whole dream of redeeming the world, of forming and establishing a redemptive community and having a covenant with him, of letting everybody on earth know that there really is a God who created each one of us and that the history of this planet is part of his story, that whole idea seems to be at risk. Because you see, that idea did not exist anywhere else in the ancient world other than in Israel. The people of Israel were the stewards of this idea. And so Nehemiah weeps not just for the spiritual condition of his people, but that every day that Jerusalem lies in ruins, the name of God is dishonored. for it sends a message to the surrounding nations that Israel's God is weak and ineffectual. As a result, for days, Nehemiah can't eat. He can't sleep. He prays and he mourns and he fasts. And then God gives him such a clarity of vision. What if we could rebuild the wall? If we can rebuild the wall, then we can rebuild the city. And if we can rebuild the city, then God can restore our community. And if God can restore our community, then we can fulfill our destiny. And if we can fulfill our destiny, then the world could be a different place. And though Nehemiah has lived in exile all his life, has never seen Jerusalem, despite all of that, after a series of masterful strokes of diplomacy, Nehemiah sets out on the long journey to Jerusalem with the backing of the king of Persia and all the resources he needs for the rebuild at his disposal. After his long journey to Jerusalem, his skills as a leader are immediately on display as he paints a compelling vision for the future for the returnees, and he organises them into teams that work tirelessly to complete one of the greatest construction stories in Israel's history. Workers are so passionate about their tasks that they sleep in their clothes, ready to work or defend at a moment's notice. Nehemiah has them carry construction tools in one hand and a weapon as the other, as they repeatedly repel those who would stop or interfere with their work. They are cheered and buoyed by Nehemiah's passion and empowered by his organisational skills and intuitive understanding of just what needed to be done. Nehemiah's strengths as a leader lay in his ability to remain focused on the goals and objectives he had set for himself. He refused to be intimidated or distracted by those attempting to subvert the rebuilding program. His single-mindedness restored pride to a nation and filled people with courage and hope. If you are in a leadership position, I hope 2020 has brought home to you just how important you are in the life of our church. Thank you to all the leaders in the various ministries that make up our church. Please never underestimate the value of your service and your gift, as you have been called by God himself to use it. As Paul says to us in Romans 12, we all have different gifts, and if yours is to lead, then do it diligently. Thank you that you work so hard to educate our young people and keep them safe. Thank you that you work so hard to anticipate problems and provide sensible solutions, for being the fixers and the visionaries that we need you to be. The second takeaway from 2020 for me was being reminded again of the power of community. Just what can be achieved when people come together in a spirit of unity, cooperating with their leaders, trusting in their vision when clearly explained to them. As important as good leadership is, leaders are powerless if their people do not rally around them and decide to act as one. The people must choose. Will they decide that their rights as individuals outweigh the collective good of the community, or will they unite together to defeat a common foe? The actions of various communities around the world, here in Victoria, and in countries such as New Zealand and Taiwan, demonstrated to the world the power of community in navigating a time of crisis. While much larger countries, on the other hand, who were unable to achieve the same sense of social cohesiveness, they surrendered to demands to protect individuals' rights and paid the price. Despite setbacks in recent days, the Victorian community showed that it was possible to come back from the brink when, with discipline and maturity, they united against COVID. The book of Nehemiah, too, is a story about the power of community. Nehemiah gave that ragtag bunch of returnees to Jerusalem a powerful sense of themselves as a people and what they could achieve when they united around a shared dream. In chapter 6 of the book, we are told that under Nehemiah's leadership, the wall around Jerusalem was built in 52 days, a remarkable achievement considering it was 2.5 miles in length. That's the equivalent of Burwood Church to Burwood One Shopping Centre. It was 40 feet high and 8 feet thick. Such was the scale of the project. What's beautiful in chapter 2 of the book is a list of every individual and family that contributed in some way to the rebuilding of the wall. Their names are remembered, listed and honoured, a recognition of the fact that this was not just Nehemiah's triumph, it was a triumph of the people. Defeated as individuals, when they came together as one under Nehemiah's leadership, great things became possible. Not only did they build the walls of Jerusalem in record time, but the people began to believe again in a God who could be trusted to keep his promises. Have you ever noticed how superior outcomes are always achieved and morale is at its highest when people learn to work together? There are so many lessons for us to learn from Nehemiah's story as a church. And the challenge for us from 2020 is to remember that unity, commitment to the good of the others, is the glue that will hold us together as a church. It's that which will attract others to venture in our doors and to have a powerful impact on the broader community beyond our church in 2021. So much can be achieved when people put the good of others before their own wants and desires. The third and final takeaway from 2020 for me was being reminded again of the necessity of humility. It is all too simple and so completely human to forget how fragile our lives are. Like the crockery set inside a box with the label outside saying, "Handle with care," we recalled again last year just how breakable we are. The Bible has so many metaphors by which to describe the brevity of our lives and how quickly our lives can be turned upside down, like Job's was, for example. COVID exposed the cracks, not only in our society, but in our relationship with God. We were reminded that nothing in life is certain, that the job you enjoy today may not be there tomorrow. God chooses moments of crisis and drama to speak to us, to remind us that without him we are nothing. Having restored the walls around Jerusalem, Nehemiah understood that his calling was not just to rebuild physical structures. No, he was to rebuild the spiritual heart of the nation as well. He needs the people to understand why Jerusalem was devastated in the first place. And so Nehemiah leads the city in a time of corporate repentance, where the people own their failures and humble themselves before God. They acknowledge that the nation was sent into exile as a result of their sin and for their dishonouring of the covenant relationship with God that they had enjoyed previously. You know, if 2020 taught us anything, it's that we don't always get to choose the time and manner of our deaths. But what we can do is choose how we shall live. And as horrible as COVID was, and continues to be, sadly, if it teaches us humility, if it reminds us of our dependence on God, and reminds us that every moment of every day is a gift that should never be taken for granted, then perhaps COVID has not been all bad. And a daily part of our walk with God should be to bring him our repentance for becoming so sidetracked, so caught up in our fast-paced urban rat race that we forget how much we owe him, need him, rely on him. My purpose today has been to celebrate some of the more important lessons that emerged from 2020, rather than just simply focusing on the horrible circumstances that many people had to endure. In summary, we learn to value the role our political and medical leaders play. And my prayer is that this will lead us as a church to value our spiritual leaders as well, perhaps even more than we have done in the past. 2020 was a year in which we rediscovered the power of community, the power to bring social change and defeat a common foe. When the threads of a rope unravel, it cannot bear the weight it supports and will surely snap. But if those threads remain tightly bound, the rope is virtually unbreakable. So, as a church, let's remember the power of unity and take this into the new year in dynamic ways that serves the kingdom. And finally, let us be okay with being humbled at times. To one extent or another, we were all humbled by the events of 2020. We witnessed things that we had never seen before in our lifetime, and were reminded just how much we need God in our lives. The one who can rise to his feet and say, "Peace, be still," to the storms of your life and mine. Let us be humble, and in all things give thanks, for in doing so, we will experience the peace of God which transcends all understanding, and will keep our hearts and our minds planted firmly in Christ Jesus. Stay safe, everyone, and God bless.